Blood trickled down Beatrice Morgan's palm as she gripped the jagged rocks, desperately pulling herself up the steep canyon wall. Her father's shouts echoed below, carried on the warm Arizona Territory wind of 1882. She'd rather die trying to escape than return to his drunken rage and the unwanted marriage he'd arranged with a man 3 times her age. "Get back here, girl," her father bellowed, his voice slurring with whiskey and fury. "You ain't got nowhere to run." Beatrice hauled herself over the ledge, breathing heavily, her long skirts torn and dusty. At 20 years old, she'd endured her father's temper since her mother's death 10 years prior. But tonight was different. Tonight, he'd crossed a line when he'd struck her across the face for refusing to marry Hiram Wilson, the wealthy cattle baron who'd offered a substantial bride price. She stumbled forward through the darkness, guided only by moonlight. Her reticule contained all she had left in the world, a small brooch that had belonged to her mother, $3.17, and a crumpled photograph of happier times. The night air chilled her skin as she pushed through scrubby desert brush, thorns catching at her sleeves. Hours passed as she walked, putting as much distance as possible between herself and the mining town where her father would surely be organizing a search party. Dawn arrived with aching feet and parched lips. She'd been too afraid to follow the main trail, instead cutting across open country. Now, with the sun climbing higher, Beatrice realized her mistake. The vast, empty landscape offered no shelter from the punishing heat, and her water skin hung empty at her side. By midday, her vision blurred. Each step became an act of will. The distant shape of a homestead wavered in the heat haze like a mirage. Was it real? She had no choice but to find out. Beatrice forced her leaden legs forward, focusing on the simple wooden structure that grew more substantial with each step. A small ranch materialized before her, a modest house with a barn and corral. A few cattle grazed in the distance. She hesitated at the edge of the property, knowing that approaching strangers could be dangerous for a woman alone. But the alternative was certain death from exposure. Beatrice stumbled toward the house, her throat too dry to call out. She made it as far as the water trough before collapsing beside it, barely managing to cup enough water to wet her cracked lips before darkness claimed her. "Madam? Can you hear me?" The voice seemed to come from far away. Beatrice felt strong arms lifting her, carrying her somewhere cool and dark. She struggled to open her eyes, catching glimpses of a weathered face framed by sandy hair. "Easy now," the voice soothed. "You're safe." When Beatrice finally regained full consciousness, she found herself lying on a narrow bed in a sparsely furnished room. A damp cloth rested on her forehead, and a cup of water sat on the table beside her. She tried to sit up, but dizziness forced her back down. "I wouldn't try moving just yet if I were you." Beatrice turned toward the voice. A man stood in the doorway, tall and lean, with broad shoulders and eyes the color of a summer storm. He wasn't handsome in the conventional sense, but there was something compelling about his face, a quiet strength in the set of his jaw, a gentleness in his eyes that contradicted his rugged appearance. "Where am I?" she managed to croak. "Griffin's Crossing," he answered, stepping into the room. "Though that's just what I call it. Not on any map." He approached and offered her the cup of water. "I'm Griffin Walsh. This is my ranch." "Beatrice Morgan," she replied after drinking deeply. "Thank you for your help, Mr. Walsh. Just Griffin will do." He pulled a chair close to the bed. "You want to tell me what brings a young woman to collapse at my door, looking like she's been running from the devil himself?" Fear gripped her heart. What if he decided to return her to her father? What if he was the type of man who'd take advantage of a woman in her position? Griffin seemed to read her thoughts. "You don't have to tell me anything you don't want to. But if someone's after you, I should know about it." Beatrice swallowed hard. "My father," she began, then faltered. Griffin waited patiently, not pressing her. My father arranged for me to marry a man named Hiram Wilson. He's cruel and old enough to be my grandfather. The words tumbled out in a rush. When I refused, my father became violent. I had to leave. Griffin's expression darkened. Your father hit you? Beatrice touched her cheek, where she knew a bruise was blooming. It's not the first time, but selling me to Hiram Wilson was the final straw. Griffin stood, his hands clenching at his sides. No man has the right to strike a woman or force her into marriage. His voice was quiet but filled with conviction. He looked at her directly. You can stay here as long as you need. Relief washed over Beatrice, followed quickly by suspicion. Men didn't offer shelter without expecting something in return. Why would you help me? A shadow passed over Griffin's face. Let's just say I've seen what happens when good people don't step in. He moved toward the door. Rest now. We'll talk more when you're stronger. After he left, Beatrice lay staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of her situation. The room was simple but clean, a man's room, with few personal touches. A rifle hung over the door. A Bible rested on the bedside table. Through the small window, she could see the vast expanse of rangeland stretching toward distant mountains. For the first time in years, she felt safe. Over the next few days, Beatrice regained her strength. Griffin proved to be a quiet host, giving her space while ensuring she had everything she needed. He slept in the barn, insisting she take his bed until she was well enough to help prepare the small room off the kitchen that served as a storeroom. On her fourth day at the ranch, Beatrice ventured outside, determined to be useful. She found Griffin mending a fence, his sleeves rolled up to reveal muscular forearms bronzed by the sun. Mr. Walsh, she called, approaching him with careful steps. I wanted to thank you properly for your kindness. He looked up, squinting against the sunlight. Didn't I tell you to call me Griffin? Griffin, she amended. I'm feeling much better now, and I'd like to earn my keep. I can cook, clean, so. He set down his hammer. You don't owe me anything, Miss Morgan. Beatrice, she corrected with a small smile. And I disagree. I'm imposing on your hospitality. The least I can do is contribute. He studied her for a moment, then nodded. All right, truth is I could use the help. Been living on beans and coffee for longer than I care to admit. That evening, Beatrice prepared a simple meal of stew and biscuits using the meager supplies in Griffin's pantry. They ate at his small table, the silence between them comfortable rather than awkward. This is the best meal I've had in years, Griffin said, helping himself to another biscuit. It's nothing special, Beatrice demurred, though pleased by the compliment. To me it is. He looked at her directly. I should warn you, though. Your father might come looking. Beatrice set down her spoon, appetite suddenly gone. How would he find me here? Small communities talk. Word gets around. If he's asking after a young woman traveling alone. What will you do if he comes? She asked, fearing the answer. Griffin's eyes hardened. I won't let him hurt you again. But I won't break the law either, unless forced. He hesitated. It might be wise for folks to think you're here legitimately. What do you mean? If anyone asks, you could be my cousin. Come to help after hearing about my wife's passing. The mention of a wife surprised Beatrice. She glanced around the cabin, seeing no evidence of a woman's touch. I didn't realize you were married. Pain flickered across Griffin's face. Sarah died 3 years ago. Fever took her and our unborn child. I'm so sorry, Beatrice said softly. Griffin nodded, clearly uncomfortable with the subject. It's a believable story. Gives you a reason to be here that won't raise eyebrows. Thank you, Beatrice said. I'll do whatever necessary to avoid being found. The following weeks fell into a comfortable routine. Each morning, Beatrice rose early to prepare breakfast before Griffin returned from his dawn checks of the cattle. She spent her days putting the neglected house in order, washing linens that hadn't seen soap in months, and mending Griffin's worn clothing. Griffin worked from sunrise to sunset, tending his small herd, repairing endless miles of fence, and breaking the occasional wild horse he caught in the hills. He wasn't a wealthy rancher by any measure, but his modest spread provided enough to live on. They spoke little at first, but gradually, the silences between them grew more comfortable. Beatrice learned that Griffin had come west after the war, a young man seeking a fresh start after seeing too much death. He'd worked as a cowhand on various ranches before saving enough to stake his claim on this land 6 years ago. Sarah was the daughter of a rancher I worked for near Tucson, he told her one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the desert in gold and crimson. Her father didn't approve of me, a hired hand with nothing to my name, but she was determined. She sounds brave, Beatrice observed. Griffin smiled sadly. She was braver than me in many ways. He turned to look at Beatrice. What about you? You've never mentioned your mother. Beatrice looked down at her hands. She died when I was 10. Consumption. After that, my father changed. He'd always enjoyed his whiskey, but after we lost her, it became his constant companion. She paused, memories washing over her. He wasn't always cruel. There were good days when he'd bring me a ribbon from town or tell stories about when he and my mother were young. Grief changes people, Griffin said quietly. Some more than others. It doesn't excuse what he did, Beatrice replied, a flash of anger in her voice. No, Griffin agreed. It doesn't. As June turned to July, the heat grew oppressive. Griffin taught Beatrice to ride, insisting she needed to know how in case she ever had to leave quickly. She proved a natural, quickly growing comfortable on the gentle mare Griffin had selected for her. One morning, as they rode the perimeter of the property checking for strays, Griffin pointed to the horizon. My land ends at that ridge. Everything you can see from here to there is Griffin's Crossing. It's beautiful, Beatrice said sincerely, taking in the rugged landscape that had begun to feel like home. It's not much compared to some spreads, but it's mine. Pride tinged his voice. One day I hope to build a proper house, something that would last generations. The wistfulness in his tone made Beatrice's heart ache. She wondered if he still hoped for a family to fill that future house, or if those dreams had died with Sarah. Their peaceful existence was shattered the following week when Griffin returned from town with a grim expression. Someone's asking after you, he said without preamble as he entered the house. A man matching your father's description was at the saloon, offering money for information about a young woman traveling alone. Fear clutched at Beatrice's throat. Did anyone tell him about me? Not that I know of. I've been careful not to mention you in town. Griffin removed his hat, running a hand through his hair. But it's a small community. Someone might have seen you when we rode out last week. What should we do? Beatrice asked, trying to keep the panic from her voice. Griffin paced the small room. For now, stay close to the house. Don't venture where you might be seen from the road. He checked his rifle, a habit Beatrice had noticed whenever he was worried. I'll keep my ears open. Try to find out if he's staying in town or moving on. That night, Beatrice lay awake, listening to every sound. The thought of returning to her father's control terrified her more than any physical danger. Worse was the idea of being forced to marry Hiram Wilson, a man whose reputation for cruelty toward his servants and previous wives was well known. Morning brought no relief. Griffin departed at dawn to check on a heifer that was close to calving, leaving Beatrice alone with her fears. She busied herself with baking, finding comfort in the familiar routine of measuring flour and kneading dough. The sound of approaching horses froze her in place. Wiping flour from her hands, she moved cautiously to the window. 2 riders approached, neither was Griffin. Beatrice's heart hammered in her chest. She recognized her father immediately, his stocky build, the way he sat a horse as if perpetually angry with the animal. The man with him was unfamiliar, but the star on his chest marked him as some kind of lawman. She retreated from the window, mind racing. There was no time to saddle a horse. The back door offered her only escape, but where would she go? The barn was too obvious. The open country beyond offered no immediate shelter, and Griffin was nowhere in sight. A pounding at the front door made her decision for her. Beatrice slipped out the back, crouching low as she ran toward the small root cellar Griffin had shown her during her first week. She barely made it inside, pulling the wooden doors closed above her, before she heard her father's voice. "I know she's here." The bartender at the Silver Dollar said Walsh had a young woman living with him. Said she was supposed to be his cousin, but nobody'd ever heard him mention family before. "Mr. Morgan, I can't just search a man's property without cause," came another voice, presumably the lawman's. "If Mr. Walsh returns and gives permission, by then she could be gone. She's my daughter, and she's not of sound mind. Ran off rather than marry a good, prosperous man who'd have taken care of her." Beatrice trembled in the darkness of the cellar, surrounded by the earthy smell of stored potatoes and onions. She heard footsteps circling the house, her father's voice growing more belligerent with each passing minute. Then came another sound, the rhythm of approaching hoofbeats. Griffin had returned. "What's going on here?" His voice carried clearly, tight with controlled anger. "Are you Griffin Walsh?" asked the lawman. "I am. And you're trespassing on my property." "This is Sheriff Taylor from Silver Creek," her father interjected. "I'm William Morgan. We're looking for my daughter, Beatrice. She ran away from home nearly 2 months ago." "I don't see how that concerns me," Griffin replied evenly. "Word is you've got a woman staying here," the sheriff said. "Mr. Morgan is concerned for his daughter's welfare. The only woman here is my cousin, who arrived from back east to help me put my affairs in order after a long illness." Griffin's lie came smoothly. "You're welcome to speak with her when she returns from visiting our neighbors, the Hendersons. She should be back by sundown." There was a pause, and Beatrice held her breath. "Mind if we look around?" the sheriff asked. "Without a warrant?" "Yes, I mind." Griffin's voice hardened. "Unless you have reason to believe I've committed a crime?" Another tense silence followed. "I'll be back with a warrant," her father threatened. "You do that," Griffin replied, "and I'll be here with my lawyer from Tucson, ready to file charges for harassment and trespassing." Beatrice heard the jingle of bridles and the creak of saddle leather as the men remounted. "This isn't over, Walsh," her father called as they rode away. Only when the sound of hoofbeats had faded completely did Beatrice dare to push open the cellar doors. Griffin stood in the yard, staring after the departing riders, his posture rigid with tension. "Griffin," she called softly. He turned, relief washing over his features when he saw her. "You're all right." It wasn't a question, but the concern in his voice wrapped around her like a protective embrace. "I heard everything," she said, climbing out of the cellar. "Thank you for not turning me over to them." Griffin's jaw tightened. "I meant what I said the day you arrived. You can stay as long as you need." "They'll be back," Beatrice said, brushing dirt from her skirt. "Probably." Griffin nodded grimly. "But not today. And tomorrow we'll be ready." That evening, after securing the house and barn, Griffin joined Beatrice at the table where she sat mending one of his shirts. The lantern cast warm light across her features, highlighting the determined set of her mouth. "I've been thinking," he said, sitting across from her. Your father won't give up easily. Not if there's money involved with this marriage he arranged. Hiram Wilson is one of the wealthiest men in the territory, Beatrice confirmed. And he's determined to have a young wife to give him heirs. My father would receive enough money to pay off his gambling debts and keep him in whiskey for years. Griffin's expression darkened. Then we need a more permanent solution than hiding. What do you mean? He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. In the eyes of the law, your father has certain rights over you until you're married. But if you were wed to someone else... Beatrice's hands stilled. Are you suggesting I find someone to marry? I'm suggesting you marry me. The words hung between them in the quiet room. Beatrice stared at him, searching for signs that he was joking or had lost his mind. That's absurd, she finally managed. Is it? Griffin leaned forward, his expression earnest. It would be a marriage in name only, of course. I wouldn't expect. That is, your virtue would be safe with me. A flush crept up his neck. But as my wife, your father would have no claim on you. Even with the sheriff's help, he couldn't force you to return. You would do that for me? Beatrice asked, incredulous. Bind yourself to a woman you barely know? Griffin's gaze held steady. I know enough. I know you're brave and resourceful. I know you work hard and don't complain. I know you deserve better than what your father planned for you. He paused. And I know that having you here has made this place feel like a home again. The simple honesty of his words touched something deep within Beatrice. Still, doubt lingered. What about when you meet someone you truly wish to marry? Someone you could love as you loved Sarah? Pain flickered in his eyes. I don't expect that to happen. After Sarah. Well, I made my peace with being alone. That's no kind of life, Beatrice protested. Neither is being forced to marry a cruel old man. Griffin reached across the table, not quite touching her hand. It wouldn't have to be forever. Once your father gives up or... When circumstances change, we could seek an annulment. Beatrice considered his offer, turning it over in her mind. A marriage of convenience wasn't what she dreamed of as a young girl, but it offered protection, security, and the freedom to determine her own future. And Griffin, he was a good man, kind and honorable in a way few men she'd encountered had been. If we did this, she said slowly, I would want it to be a true partnership. I would work alongside you, share the burdens of this place. I wouldn't expect anything less, Griffin replied. And you must promise that if you ever meet someone you wish to truly marry, you'll tell me immediately, so we can end our arrangement. Griffin nodded solemnly. I promise. Beatrice took a deep breath. Then yes, I accept your proposal, such as it is. Relief washed over Griffin's face. We'll ride into Silver Creek tomorrow. The preacher there can marry us without delay. So soon. Your father could return with that warrant at any time. Once we're wed, it won't matter. The reality of what she had agreed to settled over Beatrice as she prepared for bed that night. She was going to marry a man she'd known for less than 2 months, a man who still grieved for his dead wife. It wasn't the future she had imagined for herself, but as she drifted off to sleep, Beatrice realized it was infinitely preferable to the one her father had planned. Dawn broke clear and bright the next morning. Beatrice dressed in her best dress, the one she'd carefully mended after her desperate flight through the desert. It was hardly a proper wedding gown, but it would have to do. Griffin, too, had made an effort, wearing a clean shirt and the vest he reserved for trips to town. They rode side by side towards Silver Creek, the small settlement where Griffin conducted his business. Beatrice had visited only once before, and the memory of that day of feeling normal and free for a few precious hours seemed to belong to another lifetime. Are you sure about this? Griffin asked as the buildings of Silver Creek came into view. It's not too late to change your mind. Beatrice squared her shoulders. I'm sure. Are you? He held her gaze for a long moment. Yes. The preacher, a kindly older man named Reverend Thomas, asked few questions. Griffin introduced Beatrice as a family friend who had come west to start a new life after losing her parents. It wasn't entirely a lie her mother was gone, and her father might as well be, for all the love he'd shown her. The ceremony was brief, conducted in the small chapel with only the Reverend's wife and the town's blacksmith as witnesses. When Reverend Thomas pronounced them man and wife, Griffin hesitated only a moment before placing a chaste kiss on Beatrice's cheek. "Mrs. Walsh," he said softly, and something in the way he said it made Beatrice's heart skip. They signed the marriage certificate with steady hands, Beatrice writing her new name for the first time. Beatrice Walsh. The preacher's wife hugged her warmly, whispering congratulations and pressing a small bouquet of wildflowers into her hands. As they stepped out of the chapel into the bright afternoon sunshine, Griffin tensed. Across the street, emerging from the saloon, was William Morgan. "Keep walking," Griffin murmured, placing a protective hand at the small of Beatrice's back. "Don't look at him." But it was too late. Her father had seen them. "Beatrice!" he shouted, his voice carrying down the dusty street. "Stop right there." Griffin stepped slightly in front of Beatrice as her father strode toward them, his face flushed with anger and drink despite the early hour. "Mr. Morgan," Griffin acknowledged coldly. "You've got no right to keep my daughter from me," William snarled, reaching for Beatrice's arm. Griffin blocked his move. "She's not your daughter anymore. She's my wife." William froze, his bloodshot eyes darting between them. "Wife? You're lying. See for yourself." Griffin produced the marriage certificate from his pocket. "Signed and witnessed not 20 minutes ago." William snatched the paper, his eyes narrowing as he read. When he looked up, his expression had turned calculating. "How much?" "Excuse me?" Griffin's voice was dangerously quiet. "How much to annul this farce? Wilson's still willing to pay top dollar for her. We can split it." Beatrice felt sick. Even now, her father saw her only as a commodity to be sold. Griffin took a step forward, his hands clenched at his sides. "Mr. Morgan, I suggest you leave. Now, before I forget that we're standing in front of a house of God." A small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the confrontation. William glanced around, noting the disapproving stares. "This isn't over," he hissed, thrusting the certificate back at Griffin. "No decent man marries a woman he's known for a few weeks. Everyone will know what kind of arrangement this really is." "The only indecent proposal here is yours," Griffin replied evenly. "Trying to sell your own daughter to a man old enough to be her grandfather." He placed his hand back on Beatrice's waist. "Now, if you'll excuse us, my wife and I have business to attend to." With that, he guided Beatrice toward the general store, leaving her father fuming in the street. "Are you all right?" Griffin asked once they were inside. Beatrice nodded, though her hands trembled. "He'll never stop, will he?" "He will when he realizes he has nothing to gain." Griffin's expression was grim. "But we should be prepared for him to cause trouble." The storekeeper, a round woman named Mrs. Peterson, approached with a smile. "Well, if it isn't the new Mrs. Walsh. Reverend Thomas's wife just told me the news. Congratulations to you both." Griffin's demeanor softened. "Thank you, Mrs. Peterson. Such a whirlwind romance," the woman continued, eyeing Beatrice with undisguised curiosity. "Your cousin, was she?" "That's what folks were saying." Beatrice felt heat rise to her cheeks. "A family connection," she said carefully, "but not actually cousins." Mrs. Peterson nodded knowingly. "Well, it does a heart good to see Griffin settling down again. After poor Sarah. We all worried he'd grow into a hermit out there on that ranch." She patted Beatrice's hand. "Now, "What can I get for you two lovebirds today?" They completed their shopping quickly, purchasing supplies that would allow them to avoid town for several weeks if necessary. As they loaded their purchases onto their horses, Beatrice noticed her father watching from the saloon doorway, his expression dark with hatred. The ride back to the ranch was tense, both of them alert for signs of pursuit. Only when the familiar shape of Griffin's modest homestead appeared on the horizon did Beatrice feel herself relax. "Home," Griffin said simply, and despite everything, Beatrice felt the truth of it. This place, with its weathered boards and sweeping views, had become more of a home to her in 2 months than her father's house had been in years. That evening, after the horses were tended and supper eaten, an awkward silence fell between them. The reality of their new situation, husband and wife in name, strangers in many ways, settled heavily in the small house. "I'll sleep in the barn," Griffin said finally, rising from his chair. "You don't have to," Beatrice replied quickly. "This is your home. I can take the storeroom now that we've cleared it out." Griffin shook his head. "No wife of mine is going to sleep in a storeroom, even if it is just a paper marriage." His voice was gentle but firm. "I'm comfortable in the barn. I've spent enough nights out there breaking horses to know the best spots." Beatrice wanted to argue but recognized the stubborn set of his jaw. "At least let me make up a proper bed for you out there." He agreed to that compromise, and together they carried blankets and a spare pillow to the barn. As they worked side by side, Beatrice found herself stealing glances at Griffin, at the strong line of his jaw, the way his hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, the quiet competence in his hands. She wondered what it would be like if theirs was a real marriage, built on love rather than necessity. "Thank you," she said as they finished, "for everything you've done for me." Griffin paused, looking at her directly. "You don't need to thank me. You've brought life back to this place." He hesitated, then added softly, "And to me." Before Beatrice could respond, he wished her good night and turned away, leaving her to make her way back to the house alone with her confused thoughts. Life settled into a new routine in the days that followed. They worked side by side from dawn till dusk, Beatrice learning the rhythms of ranch life while Griffin patiently taught her everything from how to milk a cow to how to mend fence. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch watching the sunset and talking about their days. Gradually, Beatrice began to share more of her past stories of her mother, who had taught her to read and sew and stand up for herself. Griffin, in turn, spoke of his time during the war, of coming west with nothing but hope, of meeting Sarah and building this place from nothing. "She would have liked you," he said one evening, surprising Beatrice. She always said this place needed a woman's touch." "I'm sure I would have liked her too," Beatrice replied softly, touched by his willingness to speak of his late wife. August brought punishing heat and the threat of drought. Griffin spent long days moving cattle to better grazing land and ensuring the precious water sources on his property remained accessible. Beatrice took over more of the daily chores, freeing him to focus on the herd. One evening, as she was preparing supper, a wagon approached the house. Beatrice tensed, reaching for the shotgun Griffin had taught her to use. She relaxed only slightly when she recognized Mrs. Peterson from the general store, accompanied by several other women she'd seen in town but never met. "Mrs. Walsh," Mrs. Peterson called cheerfully as she descended from the wagon. "We've come to welcome you properly to the community." The women swarmed into the house, arms laden with baskets and packages. Beatrice stood bewildered as they set about arranging food on the table, exclaiming over the improvements she'd made to the house, and peppering her with questions about her life before coming west. "Such a romantic story," sighed Mrs. Davis, the blacksmith's wife. "Griffin rescuing you when you collapsed at his door, nursing you back to health, falling in love." Beatrice blushed, uncomfortable with the fabrication that had clearly spread through town. It wasn't quite so dramatic. "Oh, don't be modest," Mrs. Peterson winked. "We all know Griffin Walsh wouldn't have married again unless he was head over heels. The way he looks at you when you're in town together says it all." Before Beatrice could respond, Griffin appeared in the doorway, looking as surprised as she felt by the invasion of their home. "Ladies," he greeted them, removing his hat. "To what do we owe this pleasure?" "A belated wedding celebration," announced Mrs. Peterson. "Can't have a new bride in our community without a proper welcome." Griffin's eyes met Beatrice's across the room, a silent question in them. She gave a small nod, indicating she was all right with the unexpected guests. The evening that followed was surprisingly pleasant. The women had brought an abundance of food, and their husbands arrived shortly after Griffin, bringing with them homemade whiskey and tales that had everyone laughing. Beatrice found herself relaxing, enjoying the sense of community she'd never experienced in the mining town where she'd grown up. As the night wore on, someone produced a fiddle, and the furniture was pushed aside for dancing. Griffin hesitated when Mrs. Peterson insisted he dance with his bride, but after a moment, he extended his hand to Beatrice. "May I have this dance, Mrs. Walsh?" Beatrice placed her hand in his, acutely aware of the calluses on his palm as he drew her into his arms. They moved together to the lively tune, Griffin proving himself a more accomplished dancer than she would have guessed. "You're full of surprises, Mr. Walsh," she said, slightly breathless as he guided her through a turn. "As are you," he replied, his eyes never leaving her face. "I've never seen you smile so much. I've never had so much reason to," she admitted. Something shifted in his expression, a softening around his eyes, a slight parting of his lips as if he wanted to say more. But the music ended, and the moment passed as they were drawn back into conversation with their guests. It was late when the last wagon departed, the visitors full of food and whiskey and goodwill. Beatrice stood beside Griffin in the yard, waving until the lanterns on the wagons disappeared into the darkness. "That was unexpected," Griffin said as they turned back toward the house. "But nice," Beatrice added. "They're good people." Griffin nodded, helping her gather the remaining dishes from the table. "They are. Sarah and I used to host gatherings like this before she fell ill. I'd forgotten how much I enjoyed them." They worked together in comfortable silence, cleaning up the remnants of the impromptu party. When everything was put away, Griffin lingered by the door, reluctant to leave for his bed in the barn. "Thank you," he said suddenly, "for making this place a home again." Before Beatrice could respond, he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. She stood for a long moment, her hand pressed to her chest where her heart beat a swift, confused rhythm. September brought cooler temperatures and the first hints of autumn. Griffin spent increasingly long days preparing for winter, repairing the roof, chopping wood, smoking meat for storage. Beatrice canned vegetables from their small garden and made preserves from wild berries they gathered on the high slopes above the ranch. They had heard nothing from her father since their confrontation in town, but Beatrice remained wary. Each rider that appeared on the horizon made her tense until she could confirm it wasn't William Morgan or Hiram Wilson coming to cause trouble. One crisp morning, as Beatrice hung laundry in the yard, she spotted a cloud of dust approaching from the east. Griffin was out checking cattle, not expected back until afternoon. She hurried inside for the shotgun, then positioned herself on the porch, the weapon ready but not raised. As the riders drew closer, Beatrice recognized the sheriff's distinctive hat. With him were two men she didn't know, one elderly with an authoritative bearing, the other younger, dressed in an expensive suit. "Mrs. Walsh," Sheriff Taylor called as they reined in before the house. "Is your husband at home?" "He's out with the cattle," Beatrice replied, not lowering the shotgun. "What can I do for you, Sheriff?" The older man dismounted stiffly. "Mrs. Walsh, I'm Judge Harmon from Tucson. This is Mr. Edwards, a lawyer representing Hiram Wilson. Beatrice's grip tightened on the shotgun. What business do you have here? The lawyer stepped forward. Mrs. Walsh, or should I say Miss Morgan? Mr. Wilson has reason to believe your marriage to Griffin Walsh is fraudulent, entered into solely to circumvent your father's rightful authority. My name is Beatrice Walsh, she said firmly, and my marriage is my own business, not Mr. Wilson's. That's where you're wrong, the lawyer replied smoothly. If the marriage was performed under false pretenses, with the intent to defraud Mr. Morgan of his paternal rights, it could be considered invalid. That's enough, Edwards, the judge interrupted. Mrs. Walsh, we're not here to make accusations. We're investigating a complaint. Your father has petitioned the court to have your marriage annulled on grounds of coercion and fraud. Beatrice felt cold despite the morning sun. There was no coercion or fraud. I married Griffin of my own free will. After knowing him how long? The lawyer pressed. 2 months? Less? And conveniently just in time to avoid an arranged marriage your father had negotiated. An arranged marriage I never agreed to, Beatrice replied, her voice rising. With a man known for cruelty to his previous wives. The judge raised his hand. These are serious allegations on both sides. That's why I've come to speak with you and your husband directly. And if I refuse to speak with you, then I would have to consider your father's petition more seriously, the judge said frankly. Better to clear this up now than have it drag through the courts. Beatrice hesitated, then lowered the shotgun slightly. You can wait for Griffin in the yard. I'll put on coffee. An hour passed in tense silence before Griffin rode in, immediately alert at the sight of the unexpected visitors. Beatrice met him by the corral, quickly explaining the situation while he unsaddled his horse. Judge Harmon is fair, Griffin told her quietly. I've dealt with him before in a water rights dispute. He won't be swayed by Wilson's money if the facts don't support their case. But our marriage was arranged for convenience, Beatrice whispered urgently. What if they can prove that? Griffin's eyes held hers steadily. Do you regret marrying me, Beatrice? The question caught her off guard. No, she answered honestly. I don't. Something like relief passed over his features. Then we'll tell the judge the truth that we married quickly, yes, but of our own free will, and that we've built a life together these past months. He squeezed her hand reassuringly before approaching the men waiting in the yard. The questioning that followed was thorough and at times uncomfortably personal. Judge Harmon wanted to know every detail of their meeting, courtship, and decision to marry. The lawyer, Mr. Edwards, tried repeatedly to trip them up, to find inconsistencies in their stories. So you expect us to believe, Edwards said with barely concealed scorn, that you married a woman you found collapsed on your property after knowing her for less than 2 months, with no prior connection or arrangement? Yes, Griffin replied simply. When you meet the right person, you know it. And you, Mrs. Walsh, the judge interjected. Your father claims you were engaged to marry Hiram Wilson before you ran away. Is that true? My father arranged for me to marry Mr. Wilson without my consent, Beatrice answered. I never agreed to the match. She was 20 years old, Judge, Griffin added. Old enough to make her own decisions about marriage. And the bruises she was sporting when she arrived here? Griffin continued, his voice hardening. Those were courtesy of her father when she refused to marry a man 3 times her age. The judge's expression grew grave. Is this true, Mrs. Walsh? Beatrice nodded, unconsciously touching her cheek where the bruise had long since faded. It wasn't the first time he'd struck me, but it was the last. Judge Harmon studied them both for a long moment. Mr. Edwards, would you and the sheriff give me a moment alone with Mr. and Mrs. Walsh? When the others had moved out of earshot, The judge leaned forward. Off the record, I've heard stories about Hiram Wilson and his previous marriages. None of them ended well for the wives. He glanced between Griffin and Beatrice. I don't know what arrangement brought you two together, and frankly, I don't care. What I see is a young woman who escaped a potentially dangerous situation, and a man who offered her protection the only way society allows. That's not all it is, Griffin said quietly, his eyes finding Beatrice's. Not anymore. The simple statement sent warmth spreading through Beatrice's chest. The judge nodded, seemingly satisfied. I'll dismiss your father's petition, Mrs. Walsh. As far as I'm concerned, you're a legally married woman who has chosen her own path. However, he added with a warning glance, I suggest you work on making this marriage appear less convenient. Wilson has money and influence. He may try again through different channels. Thank you, Your Honor, Beatrice said, relief washing over her. After the judge and his companions had departed, Beatrice and Griffin stood together in the yard, the tension of the past few hours slowly ebbing away. Did you mean what you said? Beatrice asked finally. About this being more than an arrangement? Griffin turned to face her, his expression more open than she'd ever seen it. Yes, he said simply. These past months with you, they've changed me, changed how I see the future. Beatrice's heart quickened. How do you see it now? With you in it, he replied, his voice rough with emotion. Not just as a convenient wife or a partner in running this place, but as, he faltered, seemingly unable to find the words. As what, Griffin? She pressed gently. As the woman I've come to love, he admitted, the words rushing out as if he'd held them back too long. I didn't expect it. After Sarah, I thought that part of me was gone for good. But you brought it back to life, Beatrice. You brought me back to life. Joy bloomed in Beatrice's chest, so intense it almost hurt. I love you too, she whispered. I think I have for weeks now, but I was afraid to admit it, even to myself. Afraid you were still too tied to Sarah's memory to see me that way. I'll always carry Sarah in my heart, Griffin said honestly. But loving her doesn't mean I can't love you just as deeply, just as completely. He reached for her hands, holding them between his own. If you'll have me not just as your protector or your partner, but as a true husband, I promise to spend every day trying to be worthy of your love. Beatrice's answer was to rise on her tiptoes and press her lips to his. The kiss was tentative at first, then grew deeper as Griffin pulled her close, his arms encircling her waist. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Griffin rested his forehead against hers. Does this mean you'll stay? Not just until your father gives up, but forever. Yes, Beatrice said, her heart full to bursting. This is where I belong. With you. That night, for the first time, Griffin didn't sleep in the barn. They shared the bed in the small house, their bodies finding each other in the darkness, learning each other with gentle hands and whispered words of love. October painted the countryside in gold and amber. Beatrice and Griffin traveled to Tucson to purchase supplies for winter, and while there, Griffin surprised her with a proper gold wedding band to replace the simple copper ring he'd hastily acquired for their ceremony. A real ring for a real marriage, he said as he slipped it onto her finger. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing Griffin's crossing in snow by mid-November. The cold months passed in cozy domesticity, with long evenings spent by the fire, planning for the future. Griffin spoke of expanding the herd, of building the larger house he'd always envisioned. Beatrice shared her dream of starting a small school for the children of neighboring ranches, many of whom had little access to education. They received word through Sheriff Taylor that Hiram Wilson had finally given up his pursuit and married a widow from California. Beatrice's father, having lost his chance at Wilson's money, had reportedly left the territory. heading for the gold fields of Colorado. "You're free," Griffin told her when the news arrived. "Truly free." Beatrice smiled, placing her hand over his. "I've been free since the day I found the courage to leave. Everything good in my life came from that decision." Spring brought new life to the ranch calves in the pastures, wildflowers on the hillsides, and the news that Beatrice was expecting their first child. "A baby?" Griffin whispered in awe, his hand gentle on her still flat stomach. "Our baby. Are you happy?" Beatrice asked, though she could read the answer in his shining eyes. "Happier than I ever thought possible," he replied, gathering her close. "When you collapsed at my door that day, I thought I was saving you. I never realized you were saving me too." On a warm day in early December 1883, just over a year after their first meeting, Beatrice gave birth to a daughter they named Grace. As she watched Griffin cradle their tiny daughter, his face transformed by wonder and love, Beatrice reflected on the journey that had brought her here from a frightened young woman fleeing her father's rage to a wife, mother, and partner in building a future filled with love. "What are you thinking?" Griffin asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. "About how sometimes the hardest paths lead to the most beautiful destinations," she replied, reaching for his hand. "And how grateful I am that mine led me to you. You can stay as long as you need." Griffin quoted his own words from their first meeting, smiling down at his wife and daughter. "Though I hope you'll stay forever." "Forever," Beatrice agreed, her heart full of love for the family they had created together. And then some. 5 years later, Griffin's Crossing had grown almost beyond recognition. The small, modest house had been replaced by a spacious 2-story home with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. The herd had tripled in size, and 2 hired hands now helped Griffin with the ranch work. Beatrice had realized her dream of starting a small school, teaching the children from neighboring ranches 3 days a week in a converted outbuilding. Grace, now 5, had been joined by a 3-year-old brother named Samuel and another baby on the way. The ranch teemed with life and laughter, a far cry from the quiet, lonely place Beatrice had stumbled upon that desperate day in 1882. On the anniversary of their meeting, Griffin always took Beatrice to the spot where she had collapsed by the water trough. This year was no different, though her advanced pregnancy made the short walk more challenging. "I remember thinking you were a mirage," Griffin said as they stood hand in hand, looking out over their thriving ranch, "a vision that would disappear if I blinked." "And I thought you were an angel," Beatrice laughed. "Though what an angel was doing on a dusty ranch in Arizona territory, I couldn't imagine." Griffin turned to her, his eyes filled with the same love that had sustained them through the challenges of building their life together. "Every day with you has been a gift, Beatrice. Every single day. Even when I burnt the roof of the old house trying to smoke that beehive," she teased. "Even then," he confirmed with a grin. "Though I'd prefer if you didn't try that again with this house." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across their land, Griffin wrapped his arm around Beatrice's shoulders. "I never thought I'd find love twice in one lifetime," he said softly. "You made me believe in second chances." Beatrice leaned into his embrace, grateful for the twist of fate that had led her to this man, this life. What had begun as an arrangement of necessity had blossomed into a love deeper and more enduring than either of them could have imagined. "To second chances," she murmured, stretching up to kiss him as the last rays of sunlight gilded their home in gold. And as they walked back toward the house where their children waited, Beatrice knew with absolute certainty that sometimes, running away could lead you exactly where you were meant to be all along.